So the third paper is Can Knowledge Empower Women to Save More for Retirement? And the presenter is Drew Anderson. He is been awarded a Stephen H. Sandell Scholarship, which is for new researchers in the field, and one of the two programs that Social Security supports in this area. The other is a dissertation fellowship. And so we're delighted to have you here, Drew.
Thank you very much. So this is going to be a paper about how financial education affects financial decision making, which has been a topic of interest for myself and my co-author, Michael Collins. So we're very thankful for support from Boston College and SSA, but what I'm going to say is representing Michael and I. So this work is motivated by the fact that women save less for retirement than men do. Women start at a disadvantage for wealth accumulation. They earn less when they're employed. They have lower labor supply typically over their lifetimes, often taking off more time to care for children and elders. They spend more on healthcare over their lifetimes, and something I just learned, they take out larger student loans. So by the time they reach retirement, they have lower Social Security and defined benefit wealth. So are they doing anything to catch up in terms of contributing more to defined contribution plans? If you look at national data, like in the CPS, the percent of women who are working and contributing to their workplace plans versus the percent of men, the gap has been closing so that women are basically caught up to men in that regard. And in some private sectors data, women are actually more likely to contribute to DC pension or DC plans. But in the public sector, for some reason, the gaps between participation between men and women remain pretty large, and that's going to be the setting for our research today. Another thing you sometimes hear is that women take less investment risk than men, so kind of putting them at a disadvantage for accumulation of wealth in retirement accounts. And that's true in some contexts and not in others, and it's also going to be true among our public sector workers. Thinking about this motivation, you might wonder why we're thinking about the individual and their gender as a unit of analysis instead of thinking about households where men and women are often paired together and can share their wealth. So the fact that women save less is not necessarily solved by inter-household sharing. Households in retirement are often single women, and even then you might think that they can still draw on some of the wealth of their deceased husband, say, but they can't draw on the financial literacy or financial decision-making of their deceased spouse. And when you look at financial literacy, basically, we're all kind of crappy at it. And I'm not exempting people in this room. Everyone's bad at financial decision-making sometimes. But women tend to be have lower levels of financial literacy approaching retirement than do men. So financial literacy, it might be easier to change that than occupation choice, some of these other big things like equal pay that are persistent differences between genders. It's still difficult to change, and a lot of studies of financial education don't find that financial literacy goes up or that people make different choices. But there's some encouraging results that show general workplace financial ed given to both men and women at the same time actually had a larger impact on whether women were planning to save, okay, or whether women actually saved more. So the question then is, what if more education efforts were targeted to women to close these gender gaps in savings? And that was the question that was brought up by the Employee Trust Funds Agency in Wisconsin. So this is the state agency that runs the pension and other employee benefits for the state. They put together this multimedia education campaign that included things like this poster saying women are twice as likely as men to live in poverty during retirement. It included things like webinars and seminars with slides like this, like think about the fact that you have Social Security, you have the retirement system, but you also have the ability to participate in defined contribution plans. And they rolled this out to state employees in Wisconsin. And the point of our research is to check whether or not it had its intended impact, which was to get people to think more about retirement savings and in particular to save more. So we're going to estimate that impact using administrative data on 31,000 state workers in Wisconsin. We're going to have monthly data on their contributions to the defined contribution plan. And relative to some of the other studies of financial education, these are great data because we have a really accurate measure of behavior over a pretty long period of time, as opposed to, for example, like a survey when you exit a financial education class. And what we're going to do to estimate the effect of Empower is to use the fact that it was rolled out in a very particular way. So Empower is what they call this suite of education things, like as I said, posters and emails, webinars, and they were directed to women. Men were not invited. So at these agencies, the program was presented to representative of 20 large central state agencies. And the representatives were the heads of affirmative action committees who are tasked with thinking about inequalities within their workplace, for example, between men and women. And a handful of them said, yes, we'd like to do this, and then others said no. So we're going to contrast men and women at their savings rates at the places that said they would do the program, before and after the program, and we're going to also look at the same thing at similar agencies where the take-up choice was not made. So this is a nice way of identifying the effect of Empower in a kind of a complex environment where lots of different things could be affecting whether you contribute. We're going to attribute increases in savings for women at Empower agencies after it was implemented to the program. And kind of the assumption here is we don't need to assume that these take-up choice didn't involve any selection bias, but we do think that it's unlikely that the individuals in this meeting really were representative of the choices of all their employees at their companies. But in addition, if you think there might be something different about the employers that decided to take up Empower versus others, we can condition for the baseline differences between them and differences in gender gaps and differences in trends. So we tend to find small increases in deferred compensation savings, and I'll give you more details on that. So I already kind of said this, Empower is a multimedia campaign. It puts things in front of people that basically they could Google, but they are put in front of people in an interesting way, in kind of a community engagement sort of way. And people are invited, for example, to these brown bag meetings where they can talk with experts and also talk with their peers about retirement savings. And importantly, there's no incentive, there's no time off work given for this. It's purely just provided as information. So if people were to respond to that information, they might go ahead and contribute more to what's called WDC. So the Wisconsin Deferred Compensation Plan. Every state employee in Wisconsin participates in the pension. They're required to give 6.6% of their earnings, and that's matched by the employer and goes into the Wisconsin retirement system. But in addition to that, about half of people participate in this WDC. It has very nice features. It's like a 401k, but for public sector workers, and the main difference is that there is no penalty for early withdrawal. So this has a kind of a nice feature of being endorsed by your workplace, and it can be automated, but it's pretty liquid. So just a quick overview of the state agencies we're looking at. There's just kind of an alphabet soup of agencies, for example, like Department of Human Services, or Health and Human Services, Department of Transportation, Department of Corrections, and so forth. This doesn't include the university or like teachers who work for the state. It doesn't include legislators, but pretty much everyone else. So what I've done is to sort the two groups of agencies into ones that took up the financial education through Empower and ones who did not, and then sorted them by employee size. So you can see there's a few big ones, and then there's a lot that are kind of in the hundreds or so of employees. And I'm just going to keep them in this order and do a few more descriptives. So it's not the case that the two groups are very different in terms of the gender breakdown. This is the percent women. I'm going to show a bunch of distributions like this, where that's the interquartile range. This is the distribution of years. So if you look at like the 25th percentile median and 75th percentile of the age of employees at these different places, the median tends to be in the mid-40s, and really there's not that much different across them. Same thing for tenure on the job. And this is earnings. So this is kind of squished because people make a lot of money at the State of Wisconsin Investment Board. So taking that out, surprising, I know. So taking that out and then dividing each one by gender, this is the gender-specific distributions of earnings at each one of these agencies. So this kind of plays out this national trend that women are earning slightly less. You can see that the darker blue box is a little higher in every single case for men. So like the median man makes more than the median woman. This isn't conditioning on anything. If we run a regression and condition for things like age and race, ethnicity. We don't have measures of education, but things like tenure, it looks like women maybe make around 91 cents on the dollar compared to their male counterparts at these employers. Another national trend that I mentioned was women take less investment risk. In the Wisconsin retirement system, there's exactly one asset allocation choice. You can just flip a switch to put a little bit more of your assets into a slightly higher risk variable fund. And this is the percent of people who do that at each one of these agencies, again, split by men and women. And men are much more, or across the board, more likely to do so, to take slightly riskier investments. Okay, so that's the lay of the land. And then getting back to our strategy for estimating the effects of Empower. The target population are women at these Empower agencies. And then there's 3 other comparison groups, men at those same agencies and men and women at other agencies that did not take up the education program. We can't observe what happened with any individual as far as whether they attended a session or read an email or went online. So we're looking at this sort of treatment happening at the level of the employer. And we have 49 months of data on all these 4 groups, which I'm going to show you now. So this is the main result here, showing this triple difference graph where along the horizontal axis is months, and then the lines trace out the percent participation in Wisconsin deferred compensation for these 4 groups. So the bottom 2 lines you hopefully can see are kind of darker. Those are the Empower agencies. And you can see the dotted line for men is higher than that of women, so that about 45% of men participate and save at least something, and 40% of women save something. And that gap kind of seems to be closing. And then after the introduction of Empower, this red line in April 2015, the women's line, which is the very bottom one, seems to tick up, which is what you would expect if the program had an impact. We're going to take that, the progression of those gender gaps and those agencies and compare them to the progression of gaps in non-Empower agencies, where, again, men are ahead of women, and actually the gap seems to widen there over time. So just looking at this graph, it looks like there could potentially be a positive estimate here for this triple difference estimate of the effect of the program. All right, so that's the extensive margin, whether we're getting excited about financial savings and so forth, gets people to move from not contributing at all to contributing something. So now think about the intensive margin, our other outcome, restricting to people who did contribute something in the pre-Empower period. Did they contribute more of their income? So the median rate of contribution, as I mentioned earlier, was like, or maybe I didn't mention this, but so the of people who save, the median is about 1.6% of your earnings, and the means are a little higher. So these are the mean percent of earnings saved in these 4 groups. So kind of curiously, the Empower agencies, they were less likely to save anything, but the ones who do save a little more. So now the dark lines are on the top. And again, there's a pretty big gap between men and women. In this case, it's 0.5 percentage points of earnings, but relative to a base of 2.5 percentage points. It doesn't look to me like this gap closes over time, or particularly not in response to Empower. And then you compare that gap to the lighter lines, which are at the non-Empower agencies, and this isn't telling as strong of a story. But in both of these graphs, there's a lot of noise going on. Maybe there's some pre-existing trends. So we're going to estimate regressions to try to use our data to the fullest to make sure what we're detecting visually is in fact an effect of Empower. So this is a bunch of regression results. There's 12 estimates up here, and they're from 12 separate regressions. The left-hand column is for the participation outcome, that extensive margin. The right-hand column for the intensive margin. And as you go down the table, there's more and more controls added. So the top line, just focusing on this 2.64 percentage points, that's the triple difference estimate you'd get if you just calculated those 8 group means and differenced them all out. So this is telling us that because their workplace decided to, at the workplace level basically, because they decided to implement a financial education program, the rate of participation among women went up by 2.64 percentage points, and this is statistically significant, on a base of something like 40 percentage points. If you control a little more flexibly for time and for different agencies, that persists. It stays at a large statistically significant effect. So then if you control for agency linear time trends, the estimate gets smaller and maybe is not statistically significant anymore, but still 1.43%. If you then use the fact that we have this panel of people and control for person fixed effects, throwing out a handful of people who switch agencies, it looks like the effect disappears. But what we're still doing is we're doing a triple difference, so we're comparing multiple differences in differences. As I said, like men weren't invited to these meetings, but they still, they're in the same building, so you might imagine men and women employees talk to each other. So we separated it by men and women instead of using men as a control group for women. So if you just look at the men-only difference in difference, it looks like maybe they actually had a positive effect, but small. And the women-only difference in difference, again, this is all with person-fixed effects, like a within-person estimate. It looks like maybe there was a positive effect there too. So many ways of estimating this, somewhat not robust to all of the potential approaches, but it looks like overall there's a small positive effect. On participation, then if you move to the right-hand column, not as much evidence that there's an effect on contributions of earnings for the people already participating. Even at the bottom, you see stars on the very bottom line, but 0.02 is pretty small relative to a baseline of 2.5 percentage points. All right, so to sum up, financial education has the potential to increase savings. It appears to encourage savings here. One limitation, we can't observe effects on other household finances. So what I'm telling you is the effect of this education program on one particular thing. We don't know whether it impacted other consumption or other kinds of savings. And this 2.4 percentage points, how can you interpret it? I think it's an important magnitude relative to general studies of financial education, which tend to find nothing. Gender gaps here are only 5 percentage points, so this actually closed them by a significant amount. And this program was developed by interested representatives, and it's very low touch, low cost, and uses existing information. So in that case, in that sense, it's potentially portable to other contexts at very low costs, and relative to the positive impact, a good effect. So thanks.